the expert. He's known as the Old House Whisperer, and he'll talk tonight about dating houses in Essex County, and with a little bit of a focus on Georgetown. John?
Thank you, Peg. This is Peg Foley. She works with me. Yeah. She also works for Historic New England. So it's really nice to be here. It's like I have a lot of friends in the audience tonight, and it's like coming home to come back to Georgetown. Years and years ago, my wife and I we were living in Cambridge, and I had a classmate who said he knew about a little historic house that was for sale on North Street in Georgetown. So we had been looking at a new house over on the Salt Flats in Raleigh, and but we could have rented it, but I had a pair of beagles, and the man who owned the house in Raleigh was Scotch, and I could see those beagles scratching the woodwork in that house. So I said, well, let's go over to Georgetown and take one more look at that house on North Street. So that's a house that now stands seriously threatened at 554 North Street in Georgetown. So I hope it could be saved, but a lot of people have written the owners, and it's just sort of sitting there. So that's how we got to Georgetown, and I really started my career here. So we get started, Peg. We ended up moving from Georgetown, going to Rocks Village, and living in this house, which we still live in. That's the Peaslee Garrison over in Rocks Village. I actually used some poetic license for our mailing and put the early 18th century brick wall back on the house. It doesn't have it now. It has a soft cement plaster front. It was built in 1710. This was known as Goodman Ayers Cartway. It's now East Broadway. It doesn't look like that now. So next. This is the house at 554 North Street. Little did I know at that time what was going to happen with that house in terms of the people I met. And one of the first people I met that was in the field was Abbott Lowell Cummings, and he came out to this house. There was a very rare summer beam in this house that had a big, heavy quarter-round chamfer molding on it. It was reused in the house and had a rat-tailed chamfer stop. And so he was very excited about that, and that's how I met him and really got started in my interest in early houses. Next. This is the Witham House. You all know it. It's out of the center in Georgetown. It's got a hewn overhang here. I think it's about 1690 or 1700. We could have bought this house with 9 acres. I have a story. Peg's always saying, you're always telling me stories. Well, I have a story on this house. I met the Bacon brothers, Roger Bacon and Reggie Bacon. Roger was a great antique dealer, and they were twins, Reggie and Roger, and they didn't know this house was here, and they found it in the moonlight one night, and they were very excited, and Reggie said, expect to see an Indian look from around the corner in this house. And so they came back the next day, and they went crazy because they couldn't find it. But they ended up finding it. Next. I like to show from Abbott's book the house in Saugus. That's the Ironmaster's house in Saugus, and you can see this is actually the same house. So I think it's very interesting to see what restoration will do. And that's the interior. That's the interior. Same room. So back in those days, this is about, I think, around 1690, this house, and we used to see a lot of rooms like that with the flowery wallpaper and all covered up and so on. So it was all opened up, and you can see they found the early interior in there with a big, heavy summer beam overhead. Next. This is the Pickman House in Salem. I had an associate. There was a group of us that took a course under Abbott Cummings many, many years ago, and one of the people that took the course with us was later an associate for me, and she was walking around downtown Salem and spotted this house that had the mansard roof. This is the Pickman House. And next. About 1686, and you see the heavy chevron vertical post raised sills, a really great house. I was actually in this house with Abbott and both the Bacon brothers, and the air was blue because they were talking loudly about it. They said it ought to be moved to Williamsburg and so on, but of course it wasn't. It stayed right there. I owned the option on this house twice, and we couldn't get it past the appeals board, so I ended up not buying it. But and then 4 years later, the person that had opposed the variance, his house was torn down, so that didn't help him. Next. This is how the house looks today in downtown Salem. It's been all restored. People can go through it. I heard a story once about a house of this period in Salem, a man I worked for, and it was being taken down, and he said they reached up in the great fireplace up inside and they found a tri-cornered hat that was still hanging on the inside of the fireplace. I didn't find one here, though. Next. This is a Victorian, the Peabody House. It's a great Victorian house in Beverly Cove, and we do books on historic houses, bound books. This is one of the houses. Henry Peabody was really he was a Renaissance man, and so I really I went out to Arkansas several years ago, and my wife used to say, "You won't look at anything that wasn't built before 1730." So I had to learn about Victorian houses out in Arkansas. We did a lot of survey work out there. So this is 1880. You see the picturesque style, the wraparound porch, and so on. So it's a very fine Victorian house, and it was on the Gold Coast in the Beverly Cove back in the 1880s. Next. There's Henry Peabody. Grew up in Salem. He was quite a man. In fact, the Peabody family lived in that house, and then the Steinerts, who were involved with the pianos, they also lived in this house. So there really were some interesting people lived there. Next. Colonial Revival stairway. At that time, they were looking, as Abbott used to say, they were looking both forward and backward. They had these picturesque houses, but then they, around 1876, they were celebrating the centennial of the Revolution, so they looked to put in early-looking trim. This is a balustrade Georgian stairway, a very fine stairway in the interior of this house. So they were trying in a way to have their cake and eat it too. Next. This is the cover of a book, a project that I did in Ipswich quite a long time back, and Abbott was the major consultant on this project, and we actually, if you can believe it, we drew the line at 1840. In other words, we didn't look at anything after 1840. So the whole concept here was to get a legal document that the owner signed so that they would agree not to change interior features without the prior written permission of the local historical commission. And I think one of the ironies about preservation is that although there are a lot of houses saved, that most of the material's on the inside. So when you see sort of an historic district, you're looking at the outside, but in wooden houses, again, most of the material is still on the inside. So this was what we were trying to do here, was to protect interior features. And we got about 15 or 16 owners actually signed the agreement, and they're on record today. Next. This is the Richard Rogers house, about 1750 gambrel roof. The corner of this house, I think, has a under 90-degree corner because it actually kept with the way the road was, so I always found that interesting. Next. This is a very fine Queen Anne wall, William and Mary wall. Dealers would come and they would buy out cupboards and so on. So again, the project, if the way our project was set up, that if someone tried to take a cupboard out, then the local commission could get out and get a court order out and stop them from taking the material out. See the Belection molding here, high-style Georgian, stop-fluted pilasters, raised panels on the inside of the cupboard. So it's a really great wall paneling, and that was really the focus of the kind of thing that we were trying to do in Ipswich. Next. This is the General Wade House. Washington stopped here. We'll talk about him later in the talk. Very fine, about 1750 gambrel. And again, that was typical of the kind of house that we were trying to involve in the Ipswich project. And there are interior preservation covenants on this house. Next. This is a house out on, I think it's Heartbreak Road. Plaster Cove cornice overhead, about 1710. I knew a contractor in Ipswich that went inside this house and went to the cellar door and opened the door and stepped in, and he went all the way to the cellar because the cellar stairs were not there. So usually these Plaster Cove cornices, they exist around the Boston area, but they're not many. I was in a town on the eastern end of Long Island once, and there was a man who specialized in those, and there were about a dozen in one town. So that was an interesting thing. Next. See the little early ship carved in the stairway there? See, there's the rigging. So occasionally we'll find these, and we'll see some later in the talk, these sort of folk art things that I think this is in the stairway of the house that we just saw. So when they were building the house, some young person probably drew this very early ship right in the sheathing, and mercifully it stayed there. I remember seeing a house once in Hingham where they put marks in the paneling for each of the children as they grew older, and they would date them. There were little dates like 1787, 1793, and so on for the height of the children. Next. This is a house in southwest Topsfield. It looks like that it's right out of Gone with the Wind. It's across from the Masconomet School. If you look here, the chimney is not quite centered, so you can look at chimney placement and have an idea whether a house is built as a 1/1 on one side or not, and I think it probably was on this east side or right-hand side here. Also, I look at the balance of window placement, and it's an odd balance, so it's indicating to me on the outside before I even go inside, it was probably an early first period house that this is the right half, is the early half. Next. So actually, I got in here. Abbott was with me in this house, and you see the long bevel chamfered summer beam. It's going from the chimney girt to the end, holding the floor above. So the hints of it being early from the outside were confirmed on getting inside and seeing the early framing. Next. This is another house in Topsfield. I got Abbott in a number of houses, some of which are in his book, and so this one's a little bit harder because there are a lot of windows, and it's not quite so easy to see which is the early part here. Next. When we get inside, though, there's a vertical carrying post and front-to-back summers. Like in the Pickman house, the summers front to back. The other house that you just saw, many of the summers come from the chimney girt out to the gable end of the house. Simple bevel chamfer here. In the house in Salem, there was a heavy quarter-round chamfer, which is earlier. Next. This is a Federal, the North Green in Topsfield. Federal doorway here, very simple, low Federal roof, although you have to be careful because it turned out that this little L here was part of the first period house that had been there first, and then they added the Federal onto it. Next. The brick end of the Topsfield Federal. These chimneys are rectangular in shape. I often date a house by the size of its, or the shape of its chimney. First period chimneys are rectangular and quite heavy, and then on into the mid 18th century they're square. Then you get into the Federal period, 1800 and so, they become rectangles and they're more delicate. Next. Of course, this is the Parson Capon house. That's just out of Topsfield. You can see how I always like these photos that show the yard like it really looked, doesn't have a really manicured lawn or anything. There are chickens there and so on. It's got a framed overhang. This was restored by George Francis Dow, who was an early architect that worked in the field. And unfortunately, there was what they call wattle and daub in the cellar between the joists, twigs and clay and so on, a form of insulation. And unfortunately, he allowed that to be taken out. It was probably one of the rarest things in Essex County in this house. Next. This is a barn that I did the appraisal on that came from the earlier house in Topsfield that I showed you and was moved down to the Historical Society and sits there today. So it's a form of preservation to be able to move a building and actually save it. So that was a good thing. Next. Anyone here know where this house stood? This is off of North Street. It's the Goodrich House, and I like to show it as kind of an example of what weathering can really do. You can see evidence. It was probably a half house here. See the windows, the odd placement of windows, 1 over 1 over 1 on the end. But there's a Georgian pediment here. But because of all the weathering, it's kind of hard to see the evidence. And you can see the Victorian people, the long dress here standing in front. Gives you some idea of what the period of time here probably was about 1880. And there had been a massacre here, the Goodrich family. Before that, next. I mean, how would you like to own that house and be thinking about having to reclabber it and all that? But I think it's a fantastic picture because it really does show it like it really was, which I always like to see. You see there's still people. There's like this man standing there in the doorway. Man over here in the corner. Pardon me?
What might that be dated?
Oh, I think that's, I think part of it's probably first period, the part we saw. See the very sharp pitch in the roof. Windows tucked right up under the eaves. Elmer Keith, who was the man who was a mentor to Abbott Cummings, used to talk about the 1 over 1 over 1 on the gable end. Yes?
One other thing, the roof is made out of slabs on a lean-to. It's just a plank slab roof.
Oh, is that right? Yeah.
Early on, those were bark slabs from the sawmill.
Yeah, I can see that now. Actually, it almost looks a little bit like it's metal, but it's not. Yeah. Yeah. Next. This is the man of Byfield. He's over near what they call a mink farm, and he's been on the front of Antiques Magazine. He's about 1660, and actually there's been a book written about these stones, and he was actually a walking stone. He was not meant to stand up. He was meant to be parallel to the ground. People would walk on him to get to the doorway, and he was on the he was on the Governor Dummer farm. I still insist on calling it Governor Dummer and not Governor's Academy, if you get my drift. Next. This is a Greek revival going into Georgetown. These, of course, the gable end of the street, vertical columns and a plank front and so on. It's really interesting to think about how few Greek houses there are in the area. I mean, it's just amazing because usually it relates to something economic, and so there are a lot of 18th century houses and there are a lot of federal houses, but there are very few Greek houses. But you have one in Georgetown as you come in from Raleigh. Next. Now I did a project out in Arkansas, going back to saying I wouldn't look at anything before 1730, and we surveyed a whole county for the Arkansas State Historical Commission, the National Register, and so I was involved with surveying about 250 of these, bungalows. This one is on. This is a very great bungalow. It's on Main Street going out to Groveland. Louise Richardson's house. She's here tonight. It's a really great building because it's almost wholly original inside, and there's a book being done on this now, which is and Louise has done a great deal of work on that as well with all the families which are from around the area. So it's really it's going to be a great thing to, I think, for the Georgetown Historical to have a copy of that book. Next. Their Richardson family. This is Flint Weston's house. This is across the street. This was the first house. I was in real estate for a long time. This is the first house I ever really sold many, many years ago. It's about 1750. There's a door in the floor of this chamber on the east side where if there was an infirm person that lived upstairs, they passed the food up through the floor. Not a great thing to think about, but you have to sort of recognize those things when you see them. Next. This is a painting. What's the name of the painter, Louise?
Oh, Job Dow.
Yeah, this Job Dow painted this of that house. See, with all the barns and the way it looked so, it was a very different scene than it is now with all the traffic going over to the Groveland Bridge. Next. This is the Savory House in what's called Savorville in Groveland. And it's got a mansard roof now, but it still has part of a federal roof. So it was a federal house built about 1820, and they obviously modernized and, quote, modernized it and put a mansard roof on after the Civil War. This is a very good house, and we'll get a look at the inside. Before we look at that, we need to look at because it relates to the house. This is a powder house over across the river in Haverhill, way up on top of the hill. And you can see this house, this powder house, from the Savory House. So let's go to the next slide. And this is the same view. See the powder house there. So this is a Rufus Porter mural painting, which is in the hall of this house, and very interesting. So you can see that they looked out and they saw the powder house. He also used it in the Rufus Porter mural painting here. Next. This is a house that we did a book on down in Groveland. In this case, you look at it immediately, the balanced window fenestration, pretty much a square chimney. So we look at it, it's probably got to be about 1750. So we went inside, and next. And I'm not sure. No, I'm not inside yet. I'm up on top of the roof. So this is a very unusual case in which we were really able to tell what was going on with this house by knowing where these flues were. Chamber, parlor, flue for the chimneys. So we actually knew that it was virtually a double house, and that because down on the first floor, the chimney had been greatly changed, so you could tell a little bit, you really couldn't tell exactly what was going on. But by being able to look from the top, you could tell there was a big fireplace on the first floor, another big fireplace on this side. And I know this is the case because, among other things, Richard Irons looked at this. He's the foremost brick mason around here. He also looked at this chimney top. Next. Anyone know where this house is? This is a hewn overhang, late first period house over in West Newbury, on the way right close to West Newbury Center. Sometimes you get lucky and you'll see a very unusual case where you've got a hewn overhang here. I've been in this house. Of course, the chimney is gone. So in a lot of cases, there have been a lot of changes, and you have to look at something that you happen to see. This is facing south. Also, another thing that I always look for is what I call angle to the road. And you can't really see it here, but this house sits back at an angle to the road. So it was put up there long before the road was actually straightened out or paved or anything. Next. This is an unusual map. Maps are, if you can get a map that really tells you something, sometimes they can be fabulous. This is 1729 map of West Newbury, and I've been all over West Newbury where this is, and seeing each of these sites, and very often you'll either see an early house or you'll see where one has been, you'll see the lilac bushes, or you can sort of tell. So it's a very rare thing to have, and the town of West Newbury has it. Also, we're going to be seeing my house, which is mentioned over across the river, which is unusual to have a house that's not part of a town being mentioned when it's across the river. Next. See, here's the Robert Peasley. That's the house that you'll see later. There it is right there. And that was Sweat's Ferry. That came over from Newbury at the bottom of the hill in Rocks Village. And so this is Haverhill. Next. The bridge going over. This is when it was originally all wooden. They say that when the lights were hung in the bridge, around 1900, that the horses would see that their shadows on the walls when they were going along would make them run faster in this bridge. Either they were trying to get out of West Newbury or they were trying to get out of Haverhill, one or the other. So this is Rocks Village here. Next. This is on the way up the hill. This is about 1780. You see the heavy Georgian roof here, balanced windows. This, curiously enough, has two really large kitchen fireplaces in the cellar, one on each side. It's probably built as a duplex because you have two kitchen fireplaces in the cellar, so there were two families living there. Often these houses were, we don't realize how many of them were actually built as duplexes. This house is about 1780. Next. Photographs can really be interesting to know what was there and to get a sense. This is a very early gambrel. This is the Morris house across from us in East Haverhill. You see the ladies. No, actually it's a George house. You see the George ladies there. And very sharp pitch in that gambrel roof. Actually, this is the original house, and then it was added on to in front in federal times, and then that was changed again. And of course, this is long gone. Somebody didn't mow the grass. You can see. Okay, next. This is our house in Haverhill. This is the one that appeared on the map of 1729. There's a record, and then other ways to look at buildings or learn about them is to look at town records. And there's in the town of Haverhill records, there was a guy from Yale that typed up all of the town records, so it's really helpful. And in those town records, there's a phrase in there that says, "A man walked by Robert Peasley's brick house in 1726." So that's a pretty good idea. At least it was there in 1726. The front wall has been changed. I think it was, Abbott used to say maybe there was an earthquake and so on. I think it was more of a stylistic change. Put in larger windows in the Georgian period and so on. It was built in 1710. There were diamond pane windows. We'll see one of those frames. With a window here, little window there. Brick walls have a tendency to retain their clues. You have wooden walls, and it's probably the fifth or sixth claverting on that wall, so you don't see the original on the exterior walls. Next. The other gable end. A projecting belt course here. Then actually I moved too fast because these were, when we bought the house, these were actually boarded up. So I couldn't wait to get a frame in there and put in, repro diamond pane windows, and I did it too fast, and the frames are probably 3/8 of an inch too wide, but I have to live with it. So here you have projecting purlins off the end wall. We had that covered with a board, and originally they had projected on both ends, so that's another early feature, early 18th century feature to have the purlins project beyond the gable end. Also, you see the L shape here. So Abbott used to say it was the only, if I can say this, the only fully developed L-shaped two-story brick manor house in New England. That's what he said about it. And I only bought it, I didn't build it. So next. We have projecting oven here from a big fireplace on the inside. So in the case of brick houses, the oven projects, whereas in a lot of in all wooden houses, those ovens are in the inside of the chimney. You don't see them, but here you see it in the brick wall. Next. This is a diamond pane window on one of the exterior walls. The frame, the diamond pane element here is a reproduction, not original, but that frame is original, and there's probably only a handful of those in all of New England that are original to the brick wall.
Where is that located?
That's on the southwest wall. Next. We were very lucky here. My father-in-law, Albert Meter, who some of you probably knew, he was a great antiquarian. I had the pleasure of knowing him and got some deeds and documents from him, and was able to get in his cellar a few times and look at the material he had. But he saw in the catalog of a New York bookstore a house that it was being advertised for the great Tory names, Addington Davenport, and no one knew who Robert and Alice Peasley were, but he knew, and they were the builders of our house. So they're their names. So we got it for $10, and it's a manuscript deed of mortgage dated 1714. So it means the house was there in 1714. So in the deed research with Laura Woodside Watkins that Abbott had done before we bought the house, there was no house on the lot as late as 1707. So this is 1714, so we always bracket 1707, 1714, and say the house is 1710. Next. This is the fireplace in the living room. Reggie Bacon did a lot with early paint. This is sort of a bayberry green color. And the house was built, we think, 2 over 2 before the L was added, even though the L looks earlier. And they had a bake oven here, we think, because they used it as a kitchen before the L was built. In these early 18th century or first period houses, the sides always go straight in. Later on, you get all into the talk about Count Rumford fireplaces with angle sides, but of course these are earlier, and so they go straight in. That's one way to date it, obviously, to date a fireplace. Next. Chamber fireplace upstairs. There's 6 fireplaces. There have been a number of changes in this house, but some of it's original. The surround around this chamber fireplace is original. Here you have William and Mary paneling, but it's probably being reused as a closet door here. There are, however, butterfly hinges. Next. This is the Hayes and Spiller Garrison over, as you go into Haverhill, you go down the end of Groveland Street, it's up on the hill. This was restored by Wallace Nutting. It's about 1725. I've been in it. It's a very fine, late chamfered frame, first period brick house. And actually we saw an ad for this in an early newspaper, and at that time it had 35 acres. So that was a long time ago. Next. This is the Chase Garrison on Main Street over near Crane Neck Street in West Newbury. You see the chimneys. In this case, the chimneys are gone, but it has a very fine chamfered frame, and it has a very fine turned balustrade stairway that's still there. Next. This is the Dustin Garrison over out on North Avenue in Haverhill. There's been a lot of changes here, a lot of sort of brickwork added and so on. It's a half house. Again, it's in that period of I think around 1715 to 1720. Next. You never know where you're going to find an early house. This one is, and I believe it's still there. This is the first period house that sits over in behind the YMCA in Haverhill. And you can see even here, where it's kind of tucked in there, it's kind of hard to see. The chimney's gone, but you can still see the odd fenestrations, the placement on the right as opposed to the left. So I've been in it. There is an early frame, and of course these are Victorian here, 2 over 2. Heaven knows the fate of this house, but still there. Next. This is a drawing of an Italianate mansion that stood in Bentonville, Arkansas, where I did worked for several years, and this is where we did the survey work on all of Benton County for the National Register. And this is a house built about 1878 by, pardon me for saying it, but by a Confederate colonel. But it doesn't look like this at all now. It's right in the middle. It's about 100 yards from the headquarters of Walmart International, so you know it looks different now. Next. This is one of those houses that was, Sears Roebuck. They actually sold house kits and so on, and that's a well-known thing. A lot of bungalows were in those kits. But they weren't all bungalows. This is, of course, a Georgian. You can see the Georgian doorway here with the dental molding and so on, and the gambrel roof. This is over on High Street in Newburyport, right near the high school. Also, it happens to be owned by my foot doctor, so that's how I knew about it. Next.
What was the date of that?
That one? Oh, I think it was put up about 1910. But if I saw it, I didn't know it had been put up there, I would have dated it maybe about, 1780, somewhere in there. This is the Lord Timothy Dexter Mansion. I was involved many years ago back in the 60s. Young people really wouldn't commute to Boston, and so I was involved with Joan Purinton, or she was involved with me, and we sold this house in the mid 60s, the Dexter Mansion, and that was sort of a turning point in a way, because after that more and more young couples came. But before that, and they couldn't give this away for $35,000 back in those days. Next.
That was the widow's walk on the top, wasn't it? What they call
Well, they call it a cupola,
Yeah.
Now this is a very rare thing. You just never know. Does anyone know where this is? I'd be very surprised if anyone did. This is over in Groveland in a federal house. It's a plaster rendition of George Washington. I think may have been done when he visited Haverhill. That's a very grand story. There's another story I know that's not quite so grand. Within a stone's throw of this house, there was a tavern, the old Parker Tavern, and I knew a story once where the man from Groveland was trying to get away from being taken into the army, and he was in the tavern. The British were coming for him, so he took a sandwich and went out, or a mutton pie, and he went out and hid in the swamp, and to this day it's known as Mutton Pie Swamp. So that was going on at the same time that George was coming in his grandeur, and they were doing a plaster rendition. We even sent this to Mount Vernon, and they really didn't know exactly what the story on this was. But it's a very interesting item. Next. So that's it, and thanks for coming. I'd be glad to answer any questions.
What period of time did the beehive ovens in the fireplaces begin? Just roughly.
Oh well, I think in the probably the 17th century, the mid to third quarter. I mean, they had to have them, so that was the method they used. Yeah. Yes.
Explain a little more about what a half house is.
Well, a half house is where they had one large room over one large room. I know Abbott used to always say smaller is not earlier. So the larger rooms were like 16 by 18 or 16 by 20. So you had a half house. You had the kitchen or the keeping room. Then you had a chamber above. And remember Abbott we used to get into all about the so-called boarding room and back on the first floor. And he said it was never the case. It was always just maybe a downstairs bedroom for an older person. But oh yes, in other words, you have a half house. You have 1/1 chimneys on the end. So those are called half houses, and then they'd add 2/2 on the other side. They'd have 1/1, so then you have 2/2. But the half house is just 1/1, and the chimney on the end. So those were half houses, and they're around here. There's one called the Narbonne House, which is in Salem, which still exists, which is a half house. Yeah, Rick. Well, are you talking about the corner posts or the? Yeah, I mean, well, they were often there, but yeah. Well, actually, there's a house here in Georgetown, which Michael Hinchliffe owns, which is late first period, which has a very interesting sort of corner post, but I would date the corner post at probably 1720, 25, so they get smaller. It's still a little chamfer. So I would say to be visibly seen that probably around 1730, you don't see them after that, but they're covered with plaster. So there are corner posts in there, but the so-called gun stock. Actually, the story of the 18th century is the vanishing of the frame. You know, they first put in ceilings, like our house in Haverhill has an original ceiling, 1710. But before that, in the 17th century, you had an open. You see the joists, you know, and it's all whitewashed and smoke stained and so on. So those corner posts can be seen up till about 1730, but then they're kind of in there, but you don't see them after that because they're plastered over. Well, thank you very much again. Pleasure to be here. Oh, I will come and view your house for the foreseeable future, on a non-paid basis. If anyone has an interest in having me look at something, I'm glad to do that. Yeah, I'd like to. Sure. Louise hasn't charged me yet so far to see her house.
John, I want to get a plug for you here. You helped us some 47 years ago when Historical Society, when I was president back then of the Pillsbury Dickinson of Witham House.
Uh-huh.
And we were able to, through your assistance, initiate restrictive deeds and covenants. So to this day, if the house is ever sold,
Yeah.
They can't tamper with the
Yeah.
exterior or whatever. And you did a super job there.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. You know, if you ever strike gold and you want to do that Ipswich project here, you could still do it. And save some interiors as well as the outside.
Now, one funny story about the Witham House, I'm going to have to tell you a little bit about. John Cole also went through that. And let me see. He said it was a fantastic building and don't touch it.
Yeah.
Which we didn't. But the building that old, when the previous person had purchased it, Poznanski's many years ago, we had just sold it. The Historical Society had, and ultimately ended up at the Brocklebank Museum, centrally located. Better situation.
Oh, I see.
But he had his parents there to visit from upstate New York.
Yeah.
And they walked across the floor and virtually went into the cellar.
Did they really?
Up to their shoulder. Yeah, the father just caught his arm.
Yeah.
Otherwise he would have got it. So what happens when you get a very old house like that is, you know, you have dry rot and everything.
Yeah.
Insects do their job. And we were lucky not to have someone at the Historical Society, you know, get injured.
Yeah, oh, sure. Yeah. Well, usually it's the other end of it. Well, the early houses are, for the most part, over-engineered. And so that's why they can go for so long without something like that happening. But it does happen, so you've really got to be, you know, careful. And the houses like that are so few and far between now. You know, we used to see them all the time, but now, you know, there's development. And we used to, when we came back from Arkansas, we went out there for about 5 years. And we came back, and brokers were using this term tear down. You know, they would say, "Oh, that's a tear down," you know, and we'd never heard that before. That's something I don't like to hear.
You hear more of the demolition delays being initiated in the various towns.
Well, they are to some degree. There was one, I think, Rick, you might have heard about this down in Beverly, down there on 1A. There's an early house down there, but it only delays the inevitable.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no. Don't get me started, because there's really no system for. I mean, there are houses that come down all the time, like in downtown West Newbury. Now they have a new bank.
Yeah.
And standing there was about a 1790 to 1800 all original house, just taken down, and couldn't stop it. Yes. That said, yeah, that's a statement that's made a lot, and yeah, you hear that, and that, well, because there are a lot of really very early houses in Ipswich. In fact, there's a gentleman here today that has one of the best early houses.
This is a settlement outside of Boston, 1540, 1630. First Road, was built and you walk around the middle of this, which is called Town Hill, to take you south, and that's where the more frustrated houses are, thanks to the treatment company. We have no frustrated houses.
We claimed that 59.
Concerned that some people, especially the numbers of first-grade houses, the ones that disassembled a few timbers, and some people actually supported it for preservation award, which is a nice thing they wanted to get.
Yeah. Yeah, that does happen.
It's pretty rare, and very significant, and we're not making them anymore.
That's true. Well, of course, the river is silted in. You know, they had their original dreams when the royal governors came that was going to be a port. You know, and they found out that when it silted in and all that they couldn't do that. That's one of the reasons they first came. And yeah, then there's tree ring analysis, which people do to get an accurate date. And I know there was one house there that Abbott said he had egg on his face because they had dated it, and then they did the tree ring analysis, and that turned out to be a generation later than what they dated it at. But that's another story. Well, they find the pattern of wet and dry years, then they see the pattern of wet and dry years, and they can tell you when the tree was cut. You can't actually tell you when it was put up, but they can see from the pattern of, you know, cross section of the tree, and then actually looking at the pattern of wet and dry years. There's an actual pattern. They can see what cross section of the trunk, but it has to be out to what they call the waney edge. You know, you have to be all the way out to the bark edge to get the right pattern. And I think now they're even using that. I've not been familiar with it, but I've heard that they're using it for other things like furniture and some other things now. Gotten more scientific, but it's pretty scientific if you get out to the waney edge. That's always possible, yeah. But if you get it out of an early house and then you cut it and look at it, you know it wasn't a century later. Yeah.
How do old houses survive? I think of our house, you know, lots of never up there. There's really no reason for this. Yeah. I know, like the preservation movement is incredible. Is it just stroke of luck, or?
Well, I think it's partially luck. I think a lot of them didn't survive. I mean, you know, it's just a bare percentage that have survived. Like in the case of our house, it was part of a farm. For 100 years, they were just hired people living in there, and they didn't make any changes. And that's why Ipswich lasted for a long time, because it was not, you know, it wasn't an upscale place for a long time, and people didn't have the money, so they left. The best thing is to leave the house alone, and that's why a lot of them survived. But I mean, there were many more. I mean, there's one occasionally, but I think it was about 300, you know, around 300 truly pre-1700 houses left, so it's not very many.
What do you think of the explanation and part that the Ipswich people were so invested in the revolution they were really bankrupted and couldn't really do much with their homes because they didn't have the money to do it?
Well, I think that, but I think in later years they didn't have a lot of money, and the things were left alone again probably through the 19th century. You know, there's not a lot of fixing up. I mean, the Dexter Mansion wasn't exactly a palace. You know, when we were dealing with it, it had been left alone for a long time, not fixed up. And now, of course, you know, you get some of these new buyers come in with a lot of money, and they watch out. You know, in terms of what they're willing to do. You got to, you know, I used to say I was the only broker in New England that represented the house as well as the seller in minute. Yeah.
The house is researching the label right now. I don't know if you have more, but the one you mentioned before, is that the funeral parlor?
Oh yeah, that's on Main Street.
Okay, that's quite a structure. Every time I drive by.
Yeah.
Is that two-man or what?
Well, that's stick style.
Oh, okay.
And actually, it's across from the Haple City Hall, And it's kind of an interesting story because it was built about 1880 by, I think, the C. Willis Damon. I think he's Haverhill's leading historical architect. And he started, or he did the 1779, the Shaw Funeral Home, which is this 4-square stick tile. Then across the street, he also did the Town Hall, which is about 1910. So he sort of bookends the Victorian era. But Haverhill's a great Victorian place. Fabulous, still. But a lot has come down. I mean, Summer Street. And there's a what's the name? There's a federal house. Oh, it's actually the Elks Club, which is on Summer Street, and it's a great federal house that sort of sits there, being the Elks Club. Yes.
I don't know my word, I'll have to read this out, but on my floorboard is a wide floorboard,
Mm-hmm.
and Mary doing some work in the house, and he said one wall is the wide pine, but the one in the front is the wide chestnut, and the chestnut is pretty fine.
I wouldn't say it was pre-pine, but of course chestnut went out. But they used chestnut, so it wouldn't surprise me to find some chestnut. You know, it doesn't particularly date it, I think. There was a blight, and chestnut kind of disappeared, but it was around for a while. It wouldn't surprise me. You know, now they literally, black walnut. You know, they wrestle black walnut off of town parks and so on. You know, literally, that kind of thing, because the wood is so valuable. Yeah, like wrestling cattle. Well, again, thanks. Thank you very much. And if you'd like to be on our mailing list or whatever, we have a list up here. Hello.
My name is Jeff Moss. I own the...
Oh, yeah, hi. Oh, yeah, yes, nice to see you.
I've done an awful lot of research on that property.
Pardon me?
I've done an awful lot of research on that
Oh, good for
property.
you, yeah.
And the various owners